They made the famous attar she had perfected with her own hands and called the work another man's, and the young woman stood silent at the back of the long cold still house in a plain grey gown while a knot of fashionable strangers praised the wonder of Harcourt Court, and never once said that the scent was hers, and they would not have believed her if she had. For they had been told she was nothing at all, not the mistress of the house, only a paid still-room woman the dead lord's cousin kept on out of charity. They had taken her home and her widow's portion, and the great estate that had been her husband's, and the very work of her own married years. And when even that was not enough, they had taken the one thing no thief should have been able to take, which was her good name. They had stood up before the whole county and said that the great Harcourt fortune had been all a sham of debt, that her husband had died secretly ruined, and that she had no claim on so much as the bed she slept in. And the county had believed them, because it is always easier to believe a smiling gentleman with a bond in his hand than a silent woman in a grey gown. And Beatrix Aldous let them, and kept her face still, and went on distilling by her own hand the famous attar that no one else in all England knew how to make, because she had learned that a wronged woman with no money and no protector and no name the world would credit has exactly two possessions left to her: her silence and her work. And she did not yet know that the great copper still in the still house, which had stood sealed and unbroken in its brick furnace these many years, with the secret of the attar believed to live inside it, was about to be taken to pieces at last and turned over to the daylight before the very people who had robbed her, and that the cold, proud man who was about to walk through the still house door to buy the famous secret would be standing there to see what her husband had cut inside it. It was a bright cold morning in the 3rd week of October when the cold Earl of Brackenhall came to Harcourt Court to learn the secret of the famous attar. And that morning is where I will begin, though Beatrix's story begins long before it. For everything that had been done to her over the 2 slow years since her husband's death was about to be undone by the breaking down of a single still and a man exacting enough to look where no one else had thought to look. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Beatrix's story, the whole of it, the forged debt and the voided jointure, and the cold room over the wash-house and the great still that kept her husband's truth in the dark of its own copper, and the cold proud man who came to buy from a thief and stayed to find a wronged woman. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young widow who has been called a charity and a pauper for 2 years, and made to make in silence the very cent that was her own life's work, is about to be made plain before the very people who could not be troubled to ask her a single question. And what she does when at last her husband still speaks her name aloud to the whole county is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how the lawful widow of a lord came to be standing silent at the back of her own still house in a servant's apron while a knot of fashionable people admired her own stolen work, you have to understand what had been done to Beatrix Aldous, and what she had been told she was, and what the world had been made to believe of her, for the better part of 2 long years. She had not been born great, and that is the first thing to know of her, for it mattered greatly to all that came after. She was the daughter of a learned country apothecary of good but modest family, a thoughtful, gentle, bookish man, who had kept a fine shop and a finer garden in a market town, and had raised his motherless girl among his stills and his presses and his shelves of blue glass. And from him, before she was grown, Beatrix had got 2 things that the great world she married into could neither give nor take away: a sound plain education and a rare patient genius for the still room. For she had it, that gift that cannot be bought and cannot be faked, a nose that could read 100 flowers and herbs and gums blind, that could stand over a file and tell you not only the rose but the soil it grew in and the day it was cut, and with it the cool exact mind and the sure unhurried hand of the true chemist, who can take the raw sweetness of a garden and by heat and patience, and the slow art of distillation draw off its very soul into a clear bright water that carries the whole summer in a single drop. Her father had seen the gift in her early and, having no son and no false pride, had taught her everything he knew and let her outrun him, and had told her, more than once, in the plain certain voice she remembered all her life, that a true scent cannot be forged, that anyone might buy a famous water, but that the truth of a scent comes up out of the hands and the nose that made it and cannot be faked or counterfeited or stolen, and that she had it, and must never let anyone tell her she did not. She had believed him, because it was true, and it was the still room that had brought her by a strange road to Harcourt Court and to the gentle scholarly lord who became her husband. For Edmund, Lord Harcourt, was a widower of middle years with no child living. A quiet, learned, solitary man who cared more for his books and his laboratory and the new chemistry that was then setting the thinking world alight than for the great society that bowed to his title. And among all his studies, the one nearest his heart was the old half-secret art of the perfumer and the distiller, the drawing off of fine essences and cordial waters, at which he labored for love in a long stone still house he had built and furnished like a gentleman's laboratory at the edge of his park. He had begun, in those years, to make a scent he thought might be something rare, a deep and living attar of his own devising, but he had not the nose for it, not truly, and he knew it. And he had come to her father's shop in his travels in search of certain materials and certain knowledge, and there he had met the apothecary's grave clever daughter, who took up his half-made scent and told him in 3 sentences, kindly and exactly, everything that was wrong with it. He had not been offended. He had been, from that hour, enchanted. Not least because she was the first person in his life who cared about the thing he cared about and knew more of it than he did. He was a great deal older than she, and he knew the world would call it a strange match, an apothecary's daughter and a lord, but he was a man who had buried one wife he had married for suitability and had been lonely 20 years. And he had no living child and no near family he loved. And he found in this grave young woman with the chemist's hands and the quiet certain mind a companion such as he had stopped believing existed. He courted her honestly and at length, and won her not with his title but with his laboratory and his kindness, and his real delight in her gift. And he married her. And if it was not at first on her side the wild love of a girl, it became over the gentle years of their marriage a deep and settled and grateful love. The love of 2 solitary clever people who had each found, late and unlooked for, the one other soul who spoke their language. And together, in the long stone still house, they had made the thing that would become famous, for she had taken his half-made attar and over the slow patient seasons of their early marriage perfected it, had found the flowers and the proportions and the secret double distillation and the long quiet maturing that turned a promising scent into a thing the like of which had not been smelled in England. A deep, warm, living attar and a clear, cordial water of extraordinary fineness that, once it was known, the great houses of the kingdom would pay almost anything to have. The work was hers, the nose was hers, the genius was hers. But the still house was his, and the name on the bottles was his, and so the world, when it came to know and covet the scent, called it the Harcourt Attar and believed it the clever invention of the learned Lord Harcourt. And neither of them, in those happy years, troubled to correct the world, because it did not then seem to matter, because they made it together, and lived on it together, and laughed about it together in the candlelit evenings over the cooling worm. He knew the truth, and told her so 100 times, that she was the true maker, that the gift was hers, that he was only her glad assistant and the keeper of her bottles. It pleased them both. It would in the end very nearly destroy her. For the celebrated attar made Harcourt Court rich, far richer than its modest acres alone could ever have done. The golden trade in the famous scent, quietly managed through agents in London, became in truth the chief fortune of the estate, the bright steady stream of money that kept the old house and its lands, and a rich estate with no child to inherit it draws heirs as honey draws wasps. Lord Harcourt's nearest male relation, the man who stood to take the title and the entailed lands at his death, was a cousin he had never much liked and had latterly come to distrust, Mr. Crispin Vane, a smooth, handsome, plausible, idle man of some 28, with a fashionable manner and fashionable debts, and a cold, calculating heart beneath a charming surface, who had run through his own small inheritance and looked to Harcourt Court and its golden trade as the answer to all his difficulties. Vane was attentive to his elderly cousin in his last years, as such men are, was forever at the court, forever helpful, forever asking after the lord's health and the estate's affairs with a tender solicitude that the dying lord, no fool, learned to read for exactly what it was. For Lord Harcourt's health had begun to fail, and as it failed, he began to see, with the clear cold sight of a clever man near death, what his cousin meant to do, and to be afraid, not for himself, but for his wife. Because here was the heart of the matter, and you must hold it clearly, for the whole of the cruelty that followed turns upon it. Beatrix was not a disputed daughter or a base-born ward whose very claim to the family could be denied. She was, openly and lawfully and beyond all question, the wedded wife of Lord Harcourt, married in the parish church before the county, the Lady Harcourt, and after his death the Dowager Lady Harcourt. Nothing could unmake that, and Vane never tried to. And being a careful and loving husband, the Lord had done the thing a careful and loving husband of property does for his wife. At their marriage he had settled upon her a proper jointure, a widow's portion fixed and secured in land and income, a part of the estate set aside by deed to be hers for her life after his death, independent of his will, beyond the reach of any heir. The very thing the law of marriage settlement existed to provide, so that a widow should never be left a beggar at the mercy of the man who took her husband's place. By that jointure, on the Lord's death, Beatrix would have a fine house of her own and a good income for life, and her independence, and her dignity, and her freedom, and the entailed title and seat would go to Vane, and the two of them need never trouble one another again. It was all properly done. It should have held. A jointure was the firmest thing the law could give a wife. But Vane did not want the estate shorn of its golden trade and burdened with a rich dowager's portion. He wanted all of it, the house and the lands, and above all the famous Attar, free and clear and his. And being unable to deny the marriage or break the jointure honestly, he set himself to break it dishonestly, by a cold and clever and patient fraud. And the instrument he chose was a forged debt. With the help of a corrupt and needy attorney named Mr. Septimus Greaves, a clever ruined man who would do anything for money, Vane caused to be drawn up a post-obit bond, a deed by which Lord Harcourt was made to acknowledge that he had secretly borrowed of his cousin Crispin Vane a very great sum of money, some years before, against the security of the whole estate, the debt to fall due upon his death. It was wholly false. The Lord had never borrowed a penny of his cousin, nor would have. But it was made to look real, written in a fair imitation of the Lord's own hand, on paper of the right age, dated years back, sealed and witnessed by two paid rogues, who would swear they had seen the Lord sign it. And it was a thing peculiarly hard to disprove, for the only man who could have flatly denied it would soon be dead. The dying lord came to know of it, or to suspect it, too late to fight it in the open, for in his last illness he was weak, and watched, and surrounded by his cousin's people, and a sick old man crying forgery from his deathbed against a smooth young heir with a sealed bond and two witnesses is a sad and easily discredited thing. But he was not idle in his last weeks, though they thought him helpless. He understood exactly what was coming, that the moment he was dead, Vane would produce the forged bond, declare the estate ruinously encumbered by its late master's own secret debts, and under color of satisfying that vast false debt, would seize the rents and the lands, and would seize above all the lands and income of Beatrix's jointure, claiming that the debt being a charge on the whole estate must be met before any widow's portion could be paid. Would in short use a forged debt to swallow the very jointure that was meant to keep her safe, and leave her with nothing. And he understood, too, the final cruelty of it, that Vane could not make the famous Attar himself, that the golden trade depended wholly on Beatrix's hands and Beatrix's nose, and that therefore Vane would not cast her out, but would keep her, stripped of everything, a pauper dependent on his charity, suffered to remain in the house only so long as she went on distilling the famous scent that he would sell as his own. He would take her fortune and her freedom and her good name, and keep her as his unpaid still-room slave. The cleverness of it was very cold and very complete, so the dying lord, in his last lucid strength, did the only thing left to him. He could not safely keep the proof of the forgery in any drawer or strongbox in the house, for the house and all in it would be Vane's. And Vane would search and burn whatever he found. He could not trust it to a lawyer, for he no longer knew which lawyers were honest. He could trust it only to one faithful old servant, and to the one place in all the world his cousin would never think to look and could not destroy without destroying the very thing he coveted. The great copper still itself. The heart of the still house. The sacred untouchable engine of the famous Attar, which no one would ever dream of taking to pieces, because the secret of the Attar was believed to live inside it. And so, in his last weeks, with the help of his one wholly trusted man, old Barnaby Tench, who had been the Lord's laboratory servant and the keeper of the still house for 30 years, and loved them both, he prepared his proof and hid it. What exactly he hid, and where, you shall learn fully when Beatrix learned it, but the shape of it I will tell you now, for it is the spine of all that follows. In a flat hidden chamber that old Tench, who had a smith's skill, soldered into the thick copper base of the great still, beneath its worm tub where the cooling water ran, wrapped close in oiled silk against the wet, the Lord laid 3 things: the genuine executed counterpart of Beatrix's marriage jointure, the true deed securing her widow's portion, of which Vane meant to suppress all copies, his own sworn and witnessed deposition, made before 2 honest men in his last days and signed in his failing hand, declaring on his soul that the post-obit bond his cousin would produce was a forgery, that he had never borrowed any such sum nor any sum at all of Crispin Vane, and naming the attorney Greaves as the forger, and, with these, the one true written formula of the famous Attar, the whole secret of its making, set down in his hand and hers together, that the world believed lived nowhere but in Beatrix's head. And then, because a hidden chamber may be found, and because he wanted a thing that could not be carried off or burned, the Lord did one thing more. With his own failing hand, guided by old Tench, he engraved into the inner copper of the still's great domed head, the curved underside of the cap that closes over the pot, that faces only down into the dark and the rising vapor while the still is set and working, and that no soul looking into the still from above can ever see. A line of words cut raised and plain in the metal itself. That Beatrix his wife was the true and only maker of the Attar, his lawful and beloved wife and rightful dowager Lady Harcourt, and that she was bidden look beneath the worm. He cut it where it would face only the breath of the work, where it would be hidden as long as the still stood whole and working, and where it would be turned to the light only on the day the great still was at last broken down and opened, and he built his whole secret upon the certainty that a still sooner or later must always be drawn and cleaned and broken down, and that copper is patient, and that a soldered chamber outlasts a soldered lie. Then Lord Harcourt died, in the early autumn, with his wife's hand in his, and his last whispered words to her were that she was the true maker, and that whatever was said of him or of her, she must keep the great still safe and never let it be carried off or melted. For the still, he said with the ghost of his old smile, has more in it than the Attar. And Beatrix, half wild with grief, took his words for the wandering tenderness of a dying man who loved his work, and did not understand them. Not then. She would understand them, every one, on a bright cold morning 2 years later, with the whole county looking on. What followed his death came swiftly and exactly as he had foreseen. The Lord was scarcely buried before Mr. Crispin Vane, now Lord Harcourt in his turn by the entail, the new master of the court, produced the forged post-obit bond. He produced it with every show of grief and reluctance, as a terrible thing he had not wished to reveal, that his poor dead cousin had, in secret and to his own shame, borrowed an enormous sum against the estate years before. Gaming debts, Vane let it be understood, or worse, and that the bond now fell due, and that the estate was, in consequence, ruinously encumbered, all but ruined, its apparent wealth a hollow show propped up over a pit of secret debt. It was a story the world swallowed whole, for the world loves nothing better than to learn that a respected man was secretly rotten. And a learned recluse who shut himself up with chemicals was just the sort of man, the gossips agreed, to have had ruinous secret vices. And under color of satisfying this vast false debt, the new lord moved at once upon the one thing the dead man had meant to keep safe. He declared that the debt being a first charge upon the whole estate, there could be no question of paying out any widow's jointure until the bond was satisfied, which, the estate being so encumbered, might be never, and so he seized the rents and the lands of Beatrix's settled portion into his own hands to satisfy the bond, and the jointure that should have made her free and independent for life was, by a stroke of forged paper and a corrupt attorney's connivance, swallowed whole, and the Dowager Lady Harcourt was left, in law and in fact, with nothing. Nothing but her name, which Vane could not take, and her work, which he could not do. And so came the final cruelty, the cold heart of the whole design. Vane did not cast her out, he could not, for he needed her hands. Instead he kept her, stripped of all, a pauper in the house that had been her home, and gave it out, with a great show of put-upon generosity, that he was keeping his cousin's penniless widow on out of pure Christian charity, since the poor woman, it seemed, had no claim on anything and nowhere else to go. He moved her out of the fine room she had shared with her husband and into a cold bare chamber over the wash-house, and put her to board below the family, and he made it understood, by 100 small humiliations, that she was now a dependent, an object of his charity, scarcely above the upper servants. And he set her to the one work he wanted of her, to go on distilling, by her own hand and her own genius, day after day in the long cold still house, the famous Harcourt Attar, the golden trade that was now to be wholly his. For Vane meant to have the Attar, all of it, that, more than the lands, was what he had forged a dead man's bond to seize. He could not make it himself, he could not, the truth be told, have told a rosewater from a brandy spirit, and knew nothing whatever of the still room beyond the smell of money that came out of it. But he could own it, and sell it, and take the praise of it. And so, while the true maker labored silent and unpaid in her grey gown, the new Lord Harcourt set himself up before the fashionable world as the proprietor and the very soul of the celebrated Harcourt Attar. He had a fine engraved brass plate cast and screwed up over the still house door, where any visitor must read it, declaring the still house and all its art the sole property of Mr. Crispin Vane, Lord Harcourt, and the famous Attar his family's secret. He let it be understood with a modest air that the great recipe was an old Harcourt mystery passed to him with the title, and that the silent woman to be seen at the still was merely a paid distiller his charity retained, a servant who turned the handle of a machine whose secret he alone possessed, and he brought the fashionable world to Harcourt Court to admire it, brought down the great ladies and the connoisseurs and the men of fashion to walk through the famous still house and exclaim over the wonderful scent and congratulate the clever Lord Harcourt on his family's marvelous art. And the true maker stood silent at the back of her own still house in a plain grey gown, taken for the help, and watched a room full of strangers praise her own work under another man's name, and said nothing, and went on with her distilling, because she had learned what such a woman has left to her, and it was her silence, and her work. Before that day comes, though, while Beatrix keeps her silent watch in the cold still house and the whole cruel design of her life is laid out plain before you, let me ask one thing of you, because the next part of her story is the part where everything begins at last to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Beatrix's story, hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There, that is the only time I will ask. Now come back to the still house, because the carriage is at the gate. It was, as I have said, a bright cold morning in the 3rd week of October, 2 autumns after the Lord's death, when a fine travelling carriage came up the drive of Harcourt Court and set down a tall, grave, plainly dressed gentleman at the door, and the cold Earl of Brackenhall walked into Beatrix's story. And to understand what he saw, and why he alone of all the great folk who had come to gape at the famous Attar, saw the truth of it in the first quarter hour, you must understand who he was. for the county had him quite wrong. The Earl of Brackenhall, Lucian Reeve, a man of some 34, was reckoned, by the fashionable world that knew him slightly, a cold and difficult and disagreeable man, proud, exacting, impossible to please, with a sharp tongue for fools and no patience for the small soft lies that grease society, heartless, the ladies said, who had tried and failed to charm him, and odd besides, for he cared nothing for the things a great lord was meant to care for, the hunting and the gaming and the politics, and shut himself up instead with his books and his instruments and his experiments like a tradesman or a German professor. All of which was, as such verdicts usually are, the truth turned inside out. For the Earl was not heartless, he was only exact. He was one of the first natural philosophers and chemists of his age, a serious man of science who corresponded with the great laboratories of Europe, and kept at his own seat a laboratory finer than most colleges could boast, and who had given his whole grave-guarded heart to a single honest pursuit, the understanding of the nature of things. And a man who has spent his life seeking exactly what is true cannot, it turns out, abide what is false, cannot smile at a comfortable fraud or nod along with a flattering lie, and so gets a name for coldness from a world that runs on both. He did not suffer fools, it was true, but it was nearer the mark to say that he could not bear to see a true thing lied about, or a real merit stolen, or a careful work passed off as the careless boast of a man who could not have made it. He loved above all things in the world a true thing truly made, and he had spent his life among such things, and could tell them, instantly and certainly, from their counterfeits. And he had come to Harcourt Court because of the Attar. For the Earl, in his chemical studies, had long been fascinated by the famous Harcourt scent, which he knew to be, by every test he could make of the few precious drops he had got, a thing of extraordinary art, a triumph of the distiller's craft far beyond the common run of perfumery, made by some process he could not fully account for, and some genius of the nose he could only admire. He had, as a younger man, exchanged a few letters with the late Lord Harcourt on chemical matters, and had formed a high regard for him, and he had been sorry to hear of his death, and sorrier and frankly puzzled to hear the strange tales of secret debts and ruin. And now, learning that the new Lord Harcourt was disposed to sell, for it was put about that the encumbered estate might part, for a very great price, with the very secret of the Attar to a worthy buyer, the Earl had come, partly to acquire if he could that secret for his own study, and partly, if the truth be told, out of a scholar's pure curiosity to see at last the famous still house and the great still, and to understand how the marvelous thing was made. He had come, in short, to look closely at a true thing, and he was the one man in England least likely to be deceived by a false one. Crispin Vane received the great Earl with delight and with every art of the plausible host, and led him out across the park to the long stone still house to show off his famous art, and there the thing began to come apart. Quietly and at once, under the Earl's cool grey eye. For the Earl asked questions. He could not help it, it was his nature, and besides he genuinely wished to know. He asked, admiring the scent, of what flowers it was chiefly composed, and in what proportion the rose to the others, and Vane, smiling, gave a vague and graceful answer that named the wrong flowers and betrayed at once that he did not know. The Earl asked very civilly about the double distillation he believed he could detect, and whether the cordial-water and the attar were drawn from the same charge or separately, and Vane, still smiling but with the first faint sweat of unease, talked smoothly around the question and answered nothing, because he had no notion what the words meant. The Earl asked to see the still at work, and asked, as any chemist would, what spirit was used and at what heat and how the maker judged the cut between the heads and the heart of the run. And Vane, now plainly out of his depth, laughed it off as the dull mysteries of the trade that he left to his people, and tried to turn the talk to the price. And all the while at the great copper still at the far end of the long room, the silent woman in the grey gown was at her work. The Earl had marked her when he came in, as one marks a servant, and thought no more of her, but as Vane floundered, the Earl's eye, which missed nothing, was drawn back to her, and he began, slowly, to watch her instead. He watched her tend the fire under the grate still with the unthinking exactness of long mastery. Watched her judge the run not by any clock but by the smell of the vapor and the feel of the worm. Dip and sniff and set aside, her grave still face wholly absorbed. Her sure work-worn hands moving over the apparatus with the absolute economy of someone who knew it as she knew her own body. Watched her, at one point, frown at the cooling water and adjust something at the worm tub with a small sure motion, and saw the running spirit clear and brighten at her touch. He watched a maker among the things she had made. And the Earl of Brackenhall, who had spent his life learning to tell a true thing from a false one, looked from the smiling lord who could not name a flower to the silent woman whose hands were making the very wonder they had all come to praise, and understood, in one cold, clear instant of certainty, the whole shape of the lie. He said nothing of it then. That was not his way. He was an exact man, and an exact man does not blurt a great accusation he cannot yet prove. But something had happened to him in that long stone room, something beyond the mere solving of a puzzle. For he had watched her face as she worked, and he had seen in it not the dull patience of a hired hand, but the deep absorbed tenderness of a maker for her work. And under it, when she did not know herself observed, a still and bottomless grief and a quiet unbroken pride that struck him to the heart. And he had seen, when a careless guest jostled her and Vane spoke to her sharply as one speaks to a servant, the way she lifted her chin and said nothing. The straight back and the steady gray eyes and the perfect dignity of a woman enduring what she would not stoop to protest, and the cold exacting Earl, who had never in his life been moved by a fashionable beauty, found that he could not look away from this silent gray-gowned woman at the still, and did not, all the rest of that strange morning, stop watching her, and rode away from Harcourt Court that afternoon with the price of the Attar still undiscussed and his whole exact mind made up to two things: to learn who she truly was, and to find out the truth. Now I must tell you who Beatrix had become in those 2 years, for the Earl's coming found her at the lowest ebb of a long endurance. She had not crumbled, that was not in her, but she had been ground very low. She had loved her husband, and grieved him truly, and into that fresh grief Vane's cruelty had fallen like salt. She had known from the first that the bond was a lie. She had lived 20 years beside a husband who had never borrowed a penny and would have told her of it if he had. But she had no way on earth to prove it. The deed looked real. The witnesses swore to it. The attorney Greaves backed it with a lawyer's authority. And a penniless widow's bare word against all that was nothing. Less than nothing, the natural complaint of a woman who had lost her income and would say anything. She had gone, in the first weeks, to her husband's old solicitor, a careful, honest country lawyer named Mr. Oliver Quill, who had drawn the marriage settlement and known the lord for 30 years and never for one moment believed in the secret debt. And Mr. Quill had been willing to fight, and had begun to ask awkward questions about the bond. But Quill was an old country attorney of modest means, and Vane was now a lord with the whole resources of the estate at his back, and the corrupt Greaves to brazen it out. And when Quill pressed too hard, Vane had him warned off and his own retainer to the estate's business withdrawn, and let it be quietly known that the troublesome old lawyer was a discredited man pursuing a baseless grudge, until poor honest Quill, outmatched and outspent, could do no more than tell Beatrix sadly that he believed her with his whole heart, and could prove nothing, and that without some new evidence fallen from heaven the forged bond would stand. And so she had no remedy in law, and she knew it, and she could not even leave. That was the trap's cruelest tooth. She had nowhere to go and nothing to go on. Her father was some years dead, his shop and competence long since gone. She had no fortune of her own and no near kin to take her in, and Vane had seen to it that she had not a shilling. She could have walked out of Harcourt Court in her grey gown with her husband's little scent flagon in her pocket and starved in a ditch, and Vane knew she would not, because she was too sensible and too proud to choose a useless death, and so she stayed, because staying was the only way to live, and because, and this she told no one, She would not leave the great still house and the great copper still that her husband with his dying breath had bidden her keep safe, though she did not know why. She stayed, and she worked, and she endured, and she kept her own counsel, and she let them think her broken, and the only acts of her own free will left to her were small and secret, and entirely her own. Every night, when the still house was dark and empty and the last of the household abed, she went down to it alone with a candle, and stood a while by the grate cooling still in the dark, and took out of her apron the small worn glass flagon of the very first true attar she and her husband had made together, that she kept always about her, and breathed it, and dipped, in a small private nightly rite whose meaning was hers alone, the plain copper measure her husband had used once into the day's clear water, as if to keep some faith with the dead, and then snuffed her candle and went up to her cold room over the wash-house and slept, and rose, and did it all again. That was her life when the Earl of Brackenhall walked into it. She had marked him, of course, the cold grave gentleman who asked so many sharp exact questions that Vane could not answer, had seen, with a still flicker of something almost like grim amusement, the new Lord flounder under them, had felt the Earl's grey eyes upon her at her work and not known what to make of them. She had thought him, that first day, only another great cold stranger come to gape and buy. She did not yet know that he was the one man in England who had looked at her and seen not a servant but a maker, and not a fraud but a wrong. What the Earl did, after that first visit, he did quietly and exactly and without one word to Beatrix, for he was a man who built his certainties before he spoke them. He went home to his own seat, and he set his mind, and his considerable fortune, and his steady discreet man of business, a weathered, close-mouthed, devoted fellow named Mr. Goodge, to the patient unraveling of the thing. He did not believe the tale of the secret debt. Everything in his exact soul revolted at it, and everything he had seen in that still house told him the truth lay the other way. And so he began as a scientist begins, by gathering the facts. He had Mr. Goodge seek out, very privately, the dead lord's discarded old solicitor, the honest outmatched Mr. Quill, and from Quill, glad beyond words to find at last a great man who would listen, the Earl learned the whole of what could be known, the marriage settlement and the proper jointure that had been drawn and that ought to have protected the widow, the sudden astonishing post-obit bond that had swallowed it, the corrupt attorney Greaves who stood behind the bond, and Quill's own unprovable certainty that the bond was forged. The Earl, weighing it all with his cool exact judgment, came to the same certainty, and more, for he, the chemist, understood what poor Quill the lawyer had not quite grasped, that the whole motive of the fraud was the attar, that a man had forged a dead man's debt to make himself master of a golden trade he had not the smallest ability to carry on, and that the keystone of the whole cruel structure was the silent woman at the still, whose hands alone kept the fraud profitable, and whose ruin was therefore not incidental but the very point. But certainty was not proof, and the Earl knew it. He needed evidence. He needed something that could stand in a court against a sealed bond and two sworn witnesses, and he could not see where on earth it was to come from, until he found, among the late Lord's chemical correspondence that had passed years before between Harcourt and himself and that the Earl had carefully kept, a letter that, read now in the light of all he knew, made the hair stir on his neck. It was an old letter, written by Lord Harcourt to the Earl in the last year of the Lord's life, ostensibly about a point of the distiller's art. But in it the Lord had written a strange passage that had meant nothing to the Earl at the time, and meant everything now. I have lately been at work, the Lord had written, upon a thing more lasting than any water I have drawn. I have been cutting, into the very crown of my great still where it faces only the rising breath of the work and no man looking down can read it. Certain words I would set beyond the reach of any forger's hand or any fire, to be read on the day the still is one day broken down and turned to the light, by the one who knows to look beneath the worm. For I have come to think, my friend, that copper is more honest than men, and keeps a truth longer. The Earl had taken it, when it came, for the whimsy of a chemist who loved his apparatus. Now he understood that the dying Lord Harcourt, foreseeing his own ruin and his wife's, had hidden the proof of the forgery in the one place his cousin would never look, and could not destroy without destroying the very still that made his fortune. That the truth was sealed in the great copper still, and that it would come to light only when the still was broken down. And here the Earl's exact mind closed upon the whole of the problem like a key in a lock, and he saw not only the truth but the way to bring it out. For a still, he knew, sooner or later, must be drawn and cleaned and broken down. Copper fouls and wants scouring, settings crack and want repair, and no still on earth stands sealed in its furnace forever. But Beatrix would never of her own will let the great still be touched, for her husband had bidden her keep it safe, and Vane, who believed the secret of the Attar somehow lived inside the very machine, guarded it as the goose that laid his golden eggs, and would never break it down for fear of harming the mystery. The still would stand sealed, and the truth with it, perhaps for years. Unless someone made it worth Vane's while to break it down himself, unless a buyer offered him so great a price for the secret of the Attar that he could not refuse. On the one condition that the secret be delivered up entire, the famous still itself taken to pieces and its every part and process laid open and explained, before witnesses, as the only proof that the whole mystery had truly been conveyed. A man buying the secret of a famous art for a fortune might very reasonably demand to see the sacred still broken open and proved. And a man who did not himself understand the still and believed the secret lived in its copper would have no choice to make the sale but to consent. And so the cold exacting Earl of Brackenhall, who had come to Harcourt Court to buy assent, conceived the design that would undo the whole fraud. He would buy the secret, at a price Vane could not refuse, and he would make the breaking down and opening of the great still, before the assembled county, the express condition of the sale, and on the day that still was turned to the light. The dead lord's truth would come out of the copper before the very people who had robbed his widow. There was one more thing the Earl needed, and he got it from the last quarter he might have looked for, and it is worth the telling, for it brought a frightened old man into the heart of the matter. For the Earl, before he committed his fortune to so strange a scheme, wished to be as sure as a careful man could be that there was indeed something hidden in the still and not merely a chemist's whimsical line of verse, and his man Mr. Goodge, making his quiet enquiries about the dead lord's household, had marked one old servant, long since turned off by Vane, who had been the lord's own laboratory man and might know more than most, old Barnaby Tench, the keeper of the still house these 30 years, who had been sent away soon after his master's death and lived now, poor and silent, in a cottage at the edge of the parish. Goodge went to him, carefully, and old Tench, who had carried his dead master's whole secret alone for 2 years, terrified to speak it, and terrified to die with it untold, took fright at first and would say nothing, for Vane had warned him sharp to hold his tongue, and he was an old man with little left to lose but his life. But when he understood, slowly, that the grave gentleman asking was the great Earl of Brackenhall, who had revered his old master and meant not Vane's good but the wronged lady's, the old man broke, and wept, and told it all, how his dying master, foreseeing the forgery, had sworn him to secrecy and set him to the work, how together, in the last weeks, by candlelight when the house slept, they had soldered the little chamber into the base of the great still beneath the worm and laid the sealed proofs within it, how the master, with his own failing hand and Tench guiding it, had cut the words into the inner crown of the still's head where they faced only the rising breath of the work, and how the master had charged him, and charged the lady through him though she did not know it, to see that the still was one day broken down and looked into and the proof beneath the worm brought out. Old Tench had kept that trust alone and in terror for 2 years, watching his mistress ground down day by day and unable to lift a hand for her, not daring to tell even her for fear Vane's people should hear of it and break the still in secret and burn the proof before any honest witness could see it. And the relief of telling it at last to a man who could act broke him utterly, and he begged the Earl, on his knees in the little cottage, to set it right while there was yet time. And the Earl, grave and exact and moved as he rarely let himself be moved, raised the old man up, and gave him his word that it should be set right. and that he should stand by at the doing of it to bear his witness and tench his testimony secret for the present. Made the Earl's certainty complete, and told him exactly where, on the day, the men must look. It was the one thing wanting, and now he had it. I have lingered on the Earl's reasoning, and I make no apology for it is the engine of all that follows, and I would have you see how it was that a thing hidden in a sealed still for 2 years was at last forced into the daylight. It was not chance. And it was not a dying man's truth coming out by miracle, but a living man's exact mind seeing how to make the truth come out, and a faithful old servant's long-kept secret guiding his hand to the place. But while the Earl built his patient design, Beatrix knew nothing of it, and her days went from bad to worse for Crispin Vane. His debts pressing and the prospect of the Earl's great offer dazzling him, grew bolder and crueler in his parade of the stolen art, and the worst of her humiliations were yet to come. For Vane, scenting the Earl's interest and the fortune it might bring, resolved to make a great show of the famous Attar to all the county, the better to talk up its value. And he gave out a grand entertainment at Harcourt Court, a day of it, with all the neighborhood invited, the centerpiece of which was to be a ceremonious viewing of the celebrated still house and the famous art, with the new Lord Harcourt himself conducting his guests through the mysteries of his family's marvelous secret. And he required the true maker to be there, at the still, working, like a part of the machinery, while he lied about her work over her bent head to a crowd of gaping strangers. It was the cruelest single day of those 2 years, and Beatrix bore it with a stillness that cost her more than anyone there could guess. She stood at her great still in her grey gown and made the attar with her own hands, while Crispin Vane walked a crowd of silk-clad guests around the long room and told them, with modest pride, that the secret of the wonderful scent had come to him with his title, an old Harcourt mystery of which he was the sole possessor, and waved a careless hand at the silent woman at the still as the person we keep to do the actual distilling. A fair hand at the work, though, of course, without understanding of the secret, which is mine alone. And the guests murmured and admired and congratulated him, and a loud fashionable lady of the neighborhood, a Mrs. Cassandra Mowbray, who fancied herself a great judge of everything, sailed up to within a foot of Beatrix and discoursed at large to the company on the wonderful art of dear Lord Harcourt, getting every reason for the scent's excellence triumphantly wrong, and then, catching sight of Beatrix's plain gown and grave face, lowered her voice to the carrying murmur such women use, and pronounced it so good of dear Lord Harcourt to keep his poor cousin's destitute widow on in some useful capacity, when the unfortunate creature, by all accounts, had been left without a penny and no claim on anything, the late lord having been so sadly embarrassed. Really, his lordship's charity did him great credit. And Beatrix stood not 3 feet away, and heard it all, and went on tending her run, and did not lift her eyes. Only her hands, for one moment, went still on the copper, and then went on. And it was worse even than that, for Vane had a further cruelty in train. He had begun, in those weeks, to pay open court to a Miss Lavinia Strood, a handsome, sharp, ambitious young woman of good family and small fortune, with an eye to the money the attar would bring, and he meant to make her the new Lady Harcourt, and to install her as mistress of the very house that had been Beatrix's, and he took a cold pleasure in parading the connection under the dead wife's nose. On the day of the entertainment he brought Miss Strood through the still house on his arm as the future mistress of all its wonders, and presented her to the company with a flourish, and the two of them stood by the great still and received the congratulations of the county as the coming lord and lady of Harcourt Court and its famous art, and Miss Strood, who knew quite well who the silent grey-gowned woman at the still was, looked Beatrix coolly up and down with the small satisfied smile of a woman enjoying her own triumph over another, and remarked to Vane, just audibly, that she supposed the woman gave no trouble. And Beatrix, the true Lady Harcourt of that house, the rightful dowager, the maker of every drop of the scent they were all praising, stood at her husband's still and watched the man who had forged her ruin present his ambitious bride as mistress of her home, and gathered her grief and her fury into the only fortress she had left, which was her perfect outward stillness, and said not one word. She would not crawl, and she would not beg, and she would not give them the spectacle of her breaking. She finished the day's run, and banked the fire, and went up alone to her cold room over the wash-house when the last carriage had gone. And there, and only there in the dark, with her husband's flagon in her hand, did she at last let the tears come, silently, for the man she had lost, and the home she had lost, and the work that was hers and would never be called hers, and then she dried them, and slept, and rose the next morning grave and still as ever, and went down to the still. There was one more thing in those weeks that cut her near as deep, and it cut the deeper for being meant kindly, and it must be told, for it shows how complete was the burial of her under Vane's lie. Among the connoisseurs who came to Harcourt Court in that season to taste and to buy was an old gentleman from a neighboring county, a Sir Marmaduke Crail, a genuine and learned amateur of fine sense who had bought the Harcourt Attar for years and loved it honestly and knew, as few did, the real difficulty of the art, and he came one afternoon to settle a great order, and Vane, scenting a sale, had the famous Attar brought out, and a tasting made in the long drawing-room before a circle of guests, with samples of the new season's making set out in their little glass phials for the old connoisseur to judge. And Vane, holding forth on his family's secret, made one of his graceful blundering claims about how the scent was achieved. And old Sir Marmaduke, who was nobody's fool in this one thing, frowned over his feel and said, bluntly, that whatever his lordship might say of the method, the maker of this present batch had a hand he would know among 1,000, a particular fineness in the cut, and a depth in the maturing that he had marked in every Harcourt Attar these 8 years, and that did not change with the change of master, and that he should very much like to shake that maker by the hand, for there was more true genius in the little field than in all the perfumers of London together. There was an awkward silence. Vane colored and laughed it off and said the old recipe did the work, the same in any careful hand. And Beatrix, who had been required to stand by the door in case the still should be wanted, heard the one wholly true thing that had been said aloud in that house in 2 years, heard a discerning stranger feel, through the very scent, the print of her own hand that no forgery could counterfeit, and all but name her the true maker to her enemy's face, and had to stand mute and unregarded while Vane turned the old man's praise aside and took the order, and could not say, I am here. It is mine. That hand you would shake is this one. It was the cruelest kindness she ever bore, and she carried the memory of it like a coal, for it had told her, past all doubt, what her father had told her long ago, that a true scent cannot be forged and the nose knows the maker though the world is fooled, and that the truth of her was there in the work for anyone with the wit to smell it, and that none of it was the smallest use to her while she had no proof a court would hear and no name the world would credit. She went back to her still that evening and worked late and alone, and was for once glad of the dark. And there was, in those same weeks, a thing that happened at the still itself that the Earl, had he known of it, would have prized, for it showed in one stroke the whole truth of who kept Harcourt Court alive. Vane, grown grand and careless and wishing to seem the master of the art before a party of guests, had taken it into his head to direct a making himself, to fuss and meddle at the still and give orders he did not understand, sending Beatrix from the room that he might show his friends how the thing was done, and in an hour he had very nearly ruined a whole great charge of the precious flowers, mismanaging the fire and the cut so that the run came over harsh and dead and worthless, a season's costly gathering on the edge of being thrown away. And it was Beatrix, called back in a fluster of panic by a frightened stillhouse under-servant when the guests had drifted off, who in a quarter of an hour of swift sure work easing the fire, rejudging the cut by the smell of the vapor, drawing off and setting by what could yet be saved, coaxing the spoiled run back from the brink with a chemist's exact hands, rescued the most of it, and turned a disaster back into the famous Attar, and never said a word of reproach, and let Vane take the credit even for the saving. No one in that house but old Barnaby Tench ever knew how near the golden trade had come to ruin in its owner's own meddling hands, nor by whose silent skill it had been saved. But Beatrix knew, and it steadied something in her, for it told her past argument that the thing they had stolen could not in truth be taken, that the Attar was hers in the one way that could never be forged or seized, in the hands and the nose that alone could make it, and that whatever paper said whose it was, the living art was hers and would die the day they were fool enough to be rid of her. That was the lowest stretch of her long humiliation. She did not know, those gray mornings, that it was also very nearly the last of it, and that the cold Earl's carriage, even then, was on its way back up the drive with an offer that would set the whole machinery of her vindication turning. For the Earl came again to Harcourt Court, a fortnight after the entertainment, and this time he came to do business, and he laid his offer before Crispin Vane in the cold exact way he did all things. He would buy, he said, the entire secret of the Harcourt Attar, the formula, the process, the whole mystery, for a sum so enormous that Vane's eyes glittered at the naming of it, a sum that would clear every debt and set the new lord up in fashionable splendor for life. But the Earl, he said, was a man of science and a careful buyer, and would not pay so vast a price for a secret on any man's bare word. He must have the thing proved and conveyed entire, and that meant the great still itself, the very engine of the art, must be broken down from its setting, the worm drawn, every part of the apparatus and every step of the process laid open and demonstrated and explained before competent witnesses, so that the Earl might satisfy himself that he had truly received the whole secret and nothing was held back, and he would have it done publicly, before a gathering of the county as honest witnesses to the conveyance, on a day to be fixed, or he would not buy at all. It was a strange condition, and Vane did not like it. Some animal instinct in him shied at the thought of taking the sacred still to pieces. But he had not the knowledge to see why it mattered, and he believed, as the Earl had counted on his believing, that the secret was somehow in the still's very make, and that to convey it he must indeed open the still. And the sum offered was so great, and his need so pressing that greed beat down on ease. And he agreed. The breaking down and opening of the great still of Harcourt Court was fixed for a bright morning a fortnight thence, before the assembled county, and the Earl rode away having set, with 3 sentences of cold exact bargaining, the stage upon which the dead lord's truth would at last be turned to the light. Beatrix, when she heard of it, was filled with a horror that astonished those few who saw it, for she who bore every cruelty in silence broke her silence now. When she understood that the great still was to be broken down, taken to pieces, drawn from its setting and opened, she went, for the first time in 2 years of her own accord to Crispin Vane, and abased her pride so far as to beg him not to break the still, that it must not be touched, that it must be kept whole, that her husband with his dying breath had charged her to keep it safe. And Vane, who had never seen her plead for anything and could not imagine she had any reason but a servant's superstition or a mad attachment to the engine of her drudgery, was merely amused and contemptuous, and told her coldly that the still was his to break or keep as he chose, that she would do as she was bid, and that if she made any trouble about it she might find his charity at an end. The road outside the gate, and Beatrix, seeing she could do nothing, went away, and was sick with a dread she could not name, for she did not know what was in the still, only that her husband had bidden her keep it safe, and she feared, with a wild grieving fear, that to break it was to break the last thing of his, and the last of his trust she had kept. She did not sleep those last nights. She went down to the dark still house, and laid her hand on the great cold copper of the still and grieved over it as over a coffin, and could not understand why her dying husband's love should have fixed so on a machine. She would understand in the morning. They all would. The day came bright and cold, a still gold October morning, and the county came with it. For the breaking of the famous still and the great sale to the great Earl had been talked of for a fortnight, and all the neighborhood crowded into the long stone still house and the yard before it to see the wonder. The Earl of Brackenhall was there, grave and exact, and very quiet, with his man Mr. Goodge at his side and, though no one marked the significance of it, with 2 other gentlemen he had brought, a sober magistrate of the county and a clever sharp-eyed London lawyer, present, the Earl said blandly, as competent witnesses to so important a conveyance. Crispin Vane was there, splendid and expansive and a little nervous, with Miss Strood on his arm, playing the lord of the manor, selling his family's mystery for a fortune. The loud Mrs. Mowbray was there, and the attorney Greaves, smooth and watchful, and all the gaping county. And at the back, in her grey gown, white-faced and still, stood Beatrix, who had been required to attend that she might explain the working of the still as its parts were opened, and who stood through it all in a silent agony, watching the men with their tools and tackle make ready to break the thing her husband had bidden her keep. And then, before them all, they broke down the great still. They drew the fire and let it cool. They unbolted the great domed head from the pot. They broke the brickwork of the setting and drew the worm from its tub, and with block and tackle rigged to the still house beam they hoisted the great copper body of the still up out of its furnace, and swung it down and set it, with much labor, mouth up upon a timber cradle on the flagstones in the middle of the long room, in the broad bright daylight from the tall windows, with all the county pressed close around to see, and the Earl of Brackenhall, who had bought the right to have every part laid open, asked in his cold clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, that the great domed head, which had been lifted off and set aside, be brought and turned over, its inner face up to the light, that he might examine, he said, the cap in which so much of the art resided. And two men lifted the great copper head, and turned it mouth up, its deep curved inner face that had closed over the pot turned now for the first time since the dying lord cut it upward to the open day. And there, cut raised and plain in the bright copper, running in a band around the inside of the crown where it had hung facing only the rising breath of the work, were words that the cold October sun now lit, for the first time since the metal was scored by a dying man's hand, plain for living eyes to read. There was a silence in the still house, a silence that began at the front where the great folk could see and ran back through the crowd like a wind through corn, as one after another those near enough leaned and looked and read. And the sharp London lawyer the Earl had brought stepped forward at the Earl's quiet nod and read the words out, slowly, in a clear carrying voice, to the whole assembled county. They were the words of the dead Lord Harcourt, cut by his own failing hand, and they said, in their old plain grave fashion, that he, Edmund, Lord Harcourt, being of sound mind though failing body, did set these words in the crown of his great still where no forger's hand could reach them nor any fire touch them, to be read on the day the still was broken down and turned to the light, that his beloved wife Beatrix was the true and only maker of the Attar of Harcourt, the whole genius and craft of it being hers and not his, that she was his lawful wedded wife and, after him, the rightful Dowager Lady Harcourt, entitled to her jointure and to all the honor of his name, and that whoever read these words was charged, for the love of God and of justice, to look beneath the worm of the still, where the proof of all was laid, and as the lawyer read the whole county turned, as one body, to look at the silent woman in the grey gown at the back of the room, who stood with her hand pressed to her mouth and the tears running unchecked down her still white face, hearing her husband's voice come up out of the copper after 2 years to call her, before them all, his true wife and the true maker, and Crispin Vane's face went the color of tallow, and he started forward with some strangled word of protest, and found the sober magistrate and the Earl of Brackenhall standing very quietly in his way. And then they looked beneath the worm. The Earl, exact to the last, asked that the base of the still be examined where the worm had been drawn, and old Barnaby Tench, who had stood all this while at the back, the one man who knew what was coming, weeping openly into his sleeve, came forward at last, and showed them where, in the thick copper of the base beneath the worm tub, a flat chamber had been soldered in and closed over. And the solder was cut, and the plate lifted, and out of the little chamber, dry in its oiled silk after 2 years against the wet of the cooling water, came the proof. Out came the genuine executed counterpart of Beatrix's marriage jointure, the true deed of her widow's portion that Vane had suppressed and denied. Plain and sealed and unanswerable, proving past any lawyer's quibble that she had been secured a great settled portion that was hers by right, and that no debt of the estate could touch. Out came the late Lord Harcourt's own sworn and witnessed deposition, made in his last days before two honest men and signed in his shaking hand, declaring on his soul and his salvation that the post-obit bond his cousin Crispin Vane would produce, or had produced, was a forgery from first to last, that he had never in his life borrowed any sum of his cousin, and naming the attorney Septimus Greaves as the man who had forged the bond and procured the false witnesses. And out came, last, the one true written formula of the famous Attar, in the dead lord's hand and his wife's together, with a line beneath it in the lord's writing affirming once more that the art was hers. The magistrate took the papers into his own hands and read them, grave and frowning, before the hushed and craning county, and the sharp London lawyer examined the jointure deed and the deposition and pronounced them, in his dry professional voice, genuine, regular, and conclusive. And the thing was done, in the space of a quarter of an hour. On the flagstones of the still house before the whole assembled neighborhood the forged bond was exposed as a forgery. The stolen jointure was proved as a right, and the true maker of the famous Attar was named by the dead in the open day. What followed quickly, as such reckonings do once the dam is broken. The attorney Greaves, seeing the deposition that named him and the magistrate's cold eye upon him, lost his nerve entirely, and being a clever man and a coward, he turned, then and there, to save his own skin, and confessed before the magistrate that the bond was indeed a forgery, that he had drawn and aged and witnessed it at Crispin Vane's procuring and for Vane's money, and that the whole tale of the secret debt was a fabrication from the first, and he begged to be admitted king's evidence against the man who had paid him. And Crispin Vane, exposed in one stroke before the whole county as a forger and a thief, the false bond struck dead in his hand, the stolen fortune snatched back, his own creature turned against him, his fine borrowed splendor collapsing about his ears, stood for one ghastly moment the center of every eye, and then, with the magistrate moving toward him and the law closing in, broke and bolted, he was taken before he reached the gate. Miss Lavinia Strood, who had come that morning to be admired as the future Lady Harcourt of the famous Attar, took one look at the ruin of her intended and the disgrace settling over his name, gathered her skirts and was gone from Harcourt Court within the hour, and was at pains ever after to let it be known she had always thought there was something not quite right about Mr. Vane, and Mrs. Cassandra Mowbray, who a fortnight before had pitied aloud the destitute charity widow at the still, was to be heard within the same quarter hour assuring all who would listen that she had perceived from the very first that the Dowager Lady Harcourt was a gentlewoman of the highest quality and the most distinguished air, and that she had never for a moment given the smallest credit to those wicked tales, and the county, which had believed Vane's lie because a smiling lord was easier to believe than a silent woman, now turned about as one and believed the truth with the same comfortable ease, and discovered that it had always in its heart known the gray-gowned woman at the still for what she was. The world is like that. It goes whichever way the proof points, and is always sure it knew the way along. But all that swirl of consequence broke around Beatrix and scarcely touched her, for she stood through it where she had stood at the first, by the great broken still, with her husband's words still ringing in the air and his proof in the magistrate's hands, and the thing she felt was too deep and too quiet for the noise around her. She had not screamed at Vane, nor wept on anyone's shoulder, nor cried out her vindication to the staring county. She had only stood, with the slow tears running down her still face, one hand resting now on the cool inscribed copper of the great still's turned head, on the very words her husband had cut there for her against this day, and understood, at last, all of it, why he had bidden her with his dying breath to keep the great still safe, what he had meant when he said the still had more in it than the Attar, what faith he had kept with her from beyond the grave when every living soul had failed her. He had known what his cousin would do, and he had not been able to stop it in his life. And so he had reached past his own death to stop it, had hidden her vindication in the one place no forger would look and no fire could reach, in the dark crown of the still where his words faced only the rising breath of the work. and had trusted, with a chemist's faith in the patience of copper and the certainty that a still must one day be broken down, that the truth would keep until the day it was needed. And it had. And she stood there with her hand on his words and grieved and rejoiced in one unbearable fullness. For the husband who had loved her so and trusted her so and provided for her so, reaching out of the grave to set right what the living had put wrong. There was one moment, in the thick of it, that Beatrix remembered all her life above the rest, and it was a small one. As the magistrate read the deposition and the truth broke over the room, old Barnaby Tench, who had carried the secret alone in terror for 2 years, came to her through the press of people, the tears streaming down his old face, and could not speak, and only took her 2 hands in his worn ones and bowed his white head over them, and she understood, in that one wordless moment, the whole weight of what this old servant had borne for her and her dead husband's sake, the long fidelity kept in silence and fear. And she pressed his hands and bent her own head to his. And the 2 of them stood so a moment in the middle of the staring county, the only 2 in all that room who had loved the dead Lord and known his faith kept, and it was worth more to her than all the vindication, that one old man's tears. And she remembered, too, the look on Crispin Vane's face in the moment the engraved words were read aloud, and he understood, all at once, that the dead man he had robbed had reached out of the very grave to ruin him. That the still he had sold for a fortune had been a trap 2 years in the closing, and that every soul in the county was turning to look at him. She remembered it without triumph, almost without anger, only with a kind of grave wonder that so much cold cleverness should come to so sudden and so public a nothing. She did not gloat. She had no need. The copper had spoken for her, and a dead man's love, and that was enough. It was the Earl of Brackenhall who in the end drew her quietly out of that crowded room into the cold, bright air of the yard, away from the staring and the noise, and it was there, for the first time, that the 2 of them truly spoke. He did not pity her. She had dreaded, through all of it, the touch of pity, and there was none in him. He spoke to her, instead, exactly and gravely, as one serious person to another, and what he said to her first, before any other thing, was not a word of comfort, but a question about her work. He asked her, the cold exacting Earl, with a kind of grave wonder in his quiet voice, how in the name of all the chemical art she had achieved the double maturing of the cordial water, which he had been unable for years to account for, and Beatrix, the true maker, looked up at this strange cold man who had pulled down a great still and broken a forged bond, and never once looked at her as a thing to be pitied, but only, from the first, as a maker and a mind and a wronged human soul to be set right, and found, to her own astonishment, that she was answering him. And the 2 of them stood in the cold yard while the county milled and gossiped behind them, and talked, gravely and exactly and with a growing and astonished pleasure on both sides, of distillation, of the cut between the heart and the heads of a run, of the patience of copper and the reading of a vapor, as 2 people talk who have each spent a lonely life loving a thing no one around them understood, and have met late and unlooked for the one other soul who speaks their language. It was not a courtship. It was something at once smaller and far larger. It was recognition. And both of them felt it, and neither of them named it, and the Earl rode home that evening having said not one word of love and having fallen, completely and for the only time in his guarded life, in love. The law took its slow grinding course after, and it ran all in Beatrix's favor, for the proof from the still was complete, and the forger had confessed. The forged bond was set aside as the fraud it was. Crispin Vane was tried, and convicted on Greaves's evidence and the dead lord's deposition, and disgraced and ruined and sent away to a long punishment. And the title, by the entail, passed beyond him to a distant and honest branch who wanted nothing of the Attar. Beatrix's jointure, proved by its genuine deed, was restored to her entire, with 2 years' wrongful arrears. And she was, in law and in fact and in the eyes of all the county, the Dowager Lady Harcourt once more. An independent gentlewoman of property and standing, free, secure, her good name washed clean. The cold room over the wash-house exchanged for the fine house her husband's care had meant her to have, and the famous Attar was hers, openly and at last, for it came out, with all the rest, whose hands and whose nose had truly made it. And the Earl of Brackenhall saw to it that the truth was known in every quarter that mattered. And the golden trade became, what it had always in justice been, the Dowager Lady Harcourt's own. She had her vindication, full and public and complete, before the very people who had watched her humiliation, and she had it, as the channel of her life had taught her to take everything, quietly with a straight back and steady eyes, and without one moment of crowing over the fallen. And she had the Earl. But not at once. And not for the asking, for here Beatrix did the thing that was most herself, and the thing that makes her story worth the telling. The Earl of Brackenhall, once the law was settled and a decent interval passed, came to her, gravely. Exactly, with no flourishes, for he was incapable of flourishes, and told her plainly that he loved her. That he had loved her from the first morning he watched her hands at the still. That he had never in his life met nor expected to meet a mind and a soul that matched his own as hers did. And that he asked her, with his whole heart, to be his wife. And Beatrix, who loved him too by then and knew it, did not fall into his arms. She had been a wife once, and a good one, and had loved her husband. But she had also just spent 2 years learning, in the hardest school there is, exactly what it is for a woman to have her whole safety and standing rest in another's hands, even a good man's, even a dead good man's, and she had been for 2 years, no one's and nothing's, owned and erased. And she found that before she could be any man's wife again, even this man's, even gladly, she needed for once in her life to be simply and wholly her own. And so she asked him to wait. She asked him for a year in which she would take up her restored house and her restored fortune and her own famous art in her own name, and stand on her own ground, and be for the first time in her whole life an independent woman answerable to no one, the maker of the Harcourt Attar in her own right and under her own name, before she gave herself, freely and from strength and not from need, to anyone at all. And the cold exacting Earl of Brackenhall, who understood her as no one else alive could have, did not argue, and did not sulk, and did not press. He bowed his head and said that he would wait as long as she asked, a year or 10 years, for that she should come to him free and whole and from her own strength was the only way he would have her. And he waited. And she had her year. She took up the fine house that was hers, and set the famous still, reset now and made whole again, its broken setting rebuilt, its parts restored, but with the great domed head deliberately and forever left so that its inner crown could be looked into, and the engraved words her husband had cut there kept bare and bright, back to its honest work. And she made the Attar of her court, in her own name, the Dowager Lady Harcourt's own famous scent, and the world that had bought it under a dead man's name and a forger's name bought it now under hers, and knew at last whose genius it was. And there was a sweetness in that year that paid back, drop for drop, the bitterness of the two before it. The great houses that had bought the Harcourt Attar for a generation went on buying it, gladly and at her own asking price, for there was no other like it in the kingdom and never had been. But now the orders came addressed to her, and the praise came to her, and the connoisseurs who had once congratulated a smiling lord on his family's mystery now sought the acquaintance of the famous Dowager Lady Harcourt, who was herself the maker of the marvelous scent, and thought it a great thing to have it from her own hand. And old Sir Marmaduke Crail, the blunt-learned gentleman who had felt the truth in a phial and asked to shake the maker's hand and been turned aside, came again to Harcourt Court when he heard the whole story, on purpose. And this time there was no smiling lord to stand between them, and Beatrix received him herself in the long still house among her coppers. And he took her hand, the hand he had said he would know among 1,000, and shook it with tears in his old eyes, and told her he had known, he had always known, that no common hand had made that scent, and that it was the proudest moment of his long life as an amateur of the art to take at last the hand of the true maker of the Harcourt Attar. And Beatrix, who had stood mute by a door while this same old man all but named her to her enemy, now stood mistress in her own still house, and let an honest man praise her honest work to her honest face, and found that she could laugh, a little for the first time in a great while, and she gave him for his journey home a phial of her best, with her own name written on it in her own hand, and watched him go off down the drive cradling it like a relic, and thought that her father and her husband would both, in their different ways, have been very glad. She stood on her own ground, free and secure and her own, for a whole turning year, and learned the taste of it, and found it good. And the Earl came, through that year, often, but as a friend and an equal and a suitor and never a claimant, and the two of them spent long grave happy hours in her still house and his laboratory, two solitary clever souls who had each found the other, and the love between them grew quiet and deep and certain and entirely free. And when the year was out, and she came to him at last, she came as she had meant to, freely and from her own strength, an independent woman choosing, not a rescued one accepting, and they were married, quietly, in the autumn, a year and a season after the day the great still was broken open, and she went to him not as a beggar saved, but as an equal joined, bringing her own famous art and her own restored fortune, and her own free heart. The Dowager Lady Harcourt, who chose to become the Countess of Brackenhall because she wished it, and not because she had any longer the smallest need. She lived long and happy and honored, the once silent woman of the still house, and famous in her own right at last, the greatest maker of fine sense of her age, working with her own hands beside the husband who was her equal and her fellow in the one art they both loved. And she kept, to the end of her long life, two small faithful customs that those who loved her understood and strangers did not. She kept always about her, in a fold of her gown, the small worn glass flagon of the very first true attar she and Edmund Harcourt had made together in the early happy years, and breathed it sometimes, in quiet moments, with a still grave tenderness for the gentle scholarly man who had seen her gift when she was young and loved her for it and reached out of his very grave to give her back her life. And she gave order, in her will and to her household, that the great still of Harcourt should be kept always so, its head left open to be looked into, the words her husband had cut inside its crown kept ever bare and bright, that any who came after, looking into the still, might read what a dying man had cut in copper facing only the breath of the work, and know that a true thing truly made, and faithfully kept, and patiently waited for, cannot be unmade by any lie, though the lie own the world for a season, and that the words a dying man cuts in copper, in the dark crown of the still where they face only the rising breath of the work, will be standing there still in the metal when every lie sworn beneath them has gone to smoke. And on the one day in all the year that was the anniversary of the day the great still was broken open and her husband's words came up into the light, the Dowager Countess would go down alone to the still house in the evening, and stand a while by the great hole still in the candle glow, and read by lamplight the words inside its crown, and breathe her old flagon, and be quiet there with the two men she had loved, and the work that was, at the last and forever, known to all the world as her own. That was the whole of Beatrix's story. The forged debt and the stolen art in the cold room over the wash-house, and the great still that kept faith when men did not, and the cold exact man who looked at a silent woman and saw a maker and a wrong, and the year she took to make herself her own before she would be anyone's, and if you have stayed by her side to the end of it, as I asked you at the first to do, then you have seen the thing I have been waiting all this while to tell you, which is that a true scent cannot be forged, and a true thing truly made will outlast the lie that steals it, and a wronged woman who keeps her silence and her work and her straight back long enough will live to read her own truth in the open day. And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.